Okay, in this clip, we're going to talk a little bit about how to respond to a common objection or a common question. And in my experience, I have been asked on certain occasions whether I am a creationist. Perhaps you have been asked that as well. I'm not really sure, but it does come up sometimes. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can navigate conversations with people and how we can ask the right questions and make the conversation move forward and not so much get defensive or just respond with one answer. We can kind of really get people to think through these issues. If they're open, obviously, they have to be willing to do it. So the first thing I do when someone asks me whether I am a creationist, I generally respond with a question. I ask them, do you mean rather than being a creationist, am I a naturalist or am I a materialist? And what I mean by that is, do I look at the worldview questions, such as these 5 worldview questions on this chart here. When I look at a view of reality or origins or humans or morality, authority, do I only think that it makes sense to believe in the column on the far left, whereas the view with no God, no creator, obviously, the one on the far right is the way to answer these 5 questions with the view that there is a creator, that a creator makes more sense, and believe in a creator is more coherent, and that gives us a grounding for all 5 of these categories. So if someone asks me if I am a creationist, I generally respond back and ask them, are you asking me if I think that nature alone or the material world alone explains all these worldview questions? The answer is no, I don't. I think the creator makes much more sense and is much more coherent and really ties in these worldview questions better than like a naturalistic or materialistic view of reality. Now, in case you're not familiar with what I mean by naturalism, there's a couple different definitions. There's what's called methodological naturalism, which is a position that says science or history should seek only natural explanations and that attempts to find supernatural causes are not science. And that's really what science is built on today. It's built on methodological naturalism, where they don't look for any kind of causation other than naturalistic causation, because science studies cause and effect relationships and they're looking for natural causes, of course. And then in contrast to that, there's something called metaphysical naturalism, which is more philosophical in nature, and that's just a view of reality. The nature is all that exists. Of course, that is a statement about reality. That's not a scientific statement, that's a philosophical statement. But some people get those confused because they sometimes say, well, science can only study things in the natural world or only looks for natural causation. But in the meantime, they've already made a decision philosophically that nature is all there is. And then they turn around and use their methodological naturalism to prove their metaphysical naturalism. And of course, they're really doing philosophy. So if that's the case, then yes, I reject that as far as the belief that nature is all there is, a statement about reality. I am not a metaphysical naturalist. Of course, most people are creationists or believe in a creator, not metaphysical naturalists. Of course, God does use the natural world, and the Bible doesn't make a distinction between supernatural and natural things. The point is that I always ask people if they're asking me if I believe that only the natural world is all there is, or material world of all there is, and the answer is no, I do not. And of course, I reject this. If someone says to me, well, this is a more likely alternative than being a creationist or believing in a creator, then of course I reject this. This is a definition from the book Chance and Necessity. This statement here, it says, man is alone and the universe is unfeeling immensity out of which he emerged by chance. Chance alone is at the very source of any innovation of all creation. The biosphere, pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. Of course, I do not believe that, and a lot of people don't think that makes sense in light of what we know. So if you're asking me if I'm a creationist versus believing that, the answer is yes, I am. I certainly believe a creator makes more sense than that. So sometimes you can put that back on them and get them to think through what they're really asking. Now, obviously, when some people hear the word creationist, they generally think of Ken Ham or Answers in Genesis. In my experience, sometimes people that are not Christians or they don't have a biblical worldview, or they don't know what we really believe. They assume that's kind of what we all believe, or they assume that that's the only creation model that's out there, is the one put forward by Answers in Genesis. Now, in this clip, I'm not going to go over every different creation model, but I think when people think of the unearthed creation model, they think that Many of us, of course, believe the Genesis creation must be 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, meaning that God created all things within 144 hours, and the Genesis genealogies don't contain any gaps, if any gaps. The creation week occurred between 6 to 10,000 years ago. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, etc., are the human descendants of Adam and Eve. Of course, they think that we would believe the flood of Noah's time in Genesis 6 to 9 was a global flood, destroyed all land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. And the flood, of course, lasted about a year, accounts for virtually all of Earth's geological features, fossils, and biodeposits, and all land animals alive today naturally descended from pairs of creatures on Noah's ship. Now, Interest in Genesis has enough information on their website to explain their beliefs about that. They just have articles upon articles of defending those views, and I'm not here to talk about that. I'm just saying that is the view when someone thinks of a creationist, that's what they're thinking of. And I don't think we need to go into each and every detail here. Like when we're talking to people, I ask if I'm a creationist. I think we need to keep it kind of basic, and we don't necessarily need to bring every single issue up of Genesis alone. I'm not against studying Genesis. I'm just saying that I don't think strategically we have to go into all these issues with somebody right away. Now, there's more than enough information in this book, Creation, Evolution, Intelligent Design. This is one of those 4 views book where it had a younger creationist, an older creationist, and an intelligent design advocate, and then a theistic evolution leader all debate, or at least talk about their views, present them in great detail, lay them out, articulate them, and critique each other. So if you want to go deeper on some of the different creation views out there, you can read that book. There's more books out there, but that's one that I would recommend that came out over the last few years. Now, sometimes when someone's asking you whether a creationist, they're also wondering what you believe about evolution, because as we know, in many cases, many people believe you have to believe one or the other. It's either, if you're not a creationist, you're an evolutionist. And another thing you want to do always, of course, is define what the person means by evolution. I always respond back what you mean by evolution, because there's many different definitions of evolution, and these are just some of them right here. Definition 1, 2, and 3 are not really incompatible with biblical faith. Um, of course, number 4 is hotly contested. And of course, the next definition right here, the blind watchmaker thesis, is definitely incompatible with biblical faith. That is the view of Richard Dawkins. He has a book called The Blind Watchmaker. And of course, I do not believe that at all. So if you want to talk to someone about evolution, just make sure they're defining what they mean. In many cases, they're going to say, of course, neo-Darwinian model or Darwinian evolution or something like that. But there are many different definitions of evolution. You should make sure they define it, and don't just take the bait and just say yes or no, or yes, or say I reject evolution, because there are a few definitions of evolution that are not are compatible with your faith. You just have to make sure you define them correctly. By the way, even answers in Genesis agree in definitions 1, 2, and 3 that I just showed on the last slide. Of course, there are people now that Christians are advocating theistic evolution. There's more enough people out there, or evolutionary creationism, I should say. They're very similar. You can look at some of the critiques of those views in these books right here, but there's some people that are saying that God is the creator, and he used evolution as the mechanism that accounts for all the biological diversity we have. And so you're welcome to read some of these books that critique those views. But there's certainly people out there within different churches and different Christian circles that do believe in theistic evolution. Now, one thing you also have to remember when we talk about the creation evolution issue, one thing I always bring up is that before you would even get to biological evolution, you certainly would have to explain how life can come from non-life, or you'd have to explain if chemical evolution has even happened, and if they know if it has happened. They're still debating it to this day. This is a book that came out this year, or most recently, and I can tell you that from what I've seen in my own research, that's still being debated. They've not figured out how life can come from inorganic matter. Things like the Miller-Urey experiment has been debated, and that is not very credible anymore. And so for anyone just to jump over to biological evolution and say, well, there you go, you don't believe in evolution, make sure that they know that you have to explain the arrival of the species. And so that's something that's dealt with a lot in this book. Also, you have to explain how we can get a finely tuned universe. You need the right universe to get life going on Earth. These are some of the books that talk about that. So you would need the right universe to begin with that's set up to allow life to get going. You also need, of course, the right Earth. You need not just any old Earth, you need the Earth that will produce life. So you really have a few steps there that are set up that have to be in place before you can even get to biological evolution. And a lot of college campuses, you take a biology class, which I took, they study biological evolution, but they don't really talk too much about these three steps that have to take place before we even get to biological evolution. So that's something we have to remember as well when we're talking to people. Now, something else that I bring up sometimes is this issue of the different kind of causes out there. If someone asks me if I'm a creationist, I certainly would say that I believe what's called an efficient cause. If you look down at these different causes that Aristotle came up with, these are based in reality. We see these all around us every day. Of course, there are there are efficient causes all around us. I mean, everywhere we go, there's agency behind things that we see. And science today does not account for any efficient cause. Science isn't the study of efficient causes, and science doesn't deal with final causation or the final cause. It's in the middle here. And I think that this is helpful. I think we need to point out that these causes are based in reality. And so if someone's asking me if I'm a creationist, sometimes I respond and ask them back. I said, are you asking me if I believe if there's an efficient cause? And the answer is yes, I do. Behind the universe or behind how life got going, of course I believe in an efficient cause. I think that what we need to remember, though, strategically speaking, is though that we don't want to get caught up in the age of the earth. I don't generally spend a ton of time on that issue with people because I don't think that's the primary issue. The main issue is whether there's a God who created. As I said, I think we need to define our terms. We need to ask people what they mean by creationist when they say, are you a creationist? And if someone asks us if we believe in evolution, as I say here, number 5, of course, as I just said, I ask them, what do they mean by evolution? And then always, I would say the first issue is what is the gospel? I generally do not spend hours and hours on trying to argue someone into a specific creation model before I get to the gospel. I'm trying to establish there is a God to begin with. And of course, people don't need the Bible to know there's a creator. And there's enough evidence out there, or there's other arguments you can use to point to creator. I'm not against Genesis and getting into Genesis eventually, but I probably don't start with Genesis with people when I'm sharing the gospel. But people have different strategies and different approaches. I'm not saying I have the only game in town, but it's just something to think about. And remember, as Paul Davies says here, he teaches there as an estate. He is not a Christian. He says here, clearly then, both religion and science are founded on faith, namely on belief in the existence of something outside the universe, like an unexplained God or an unexplained set of physical laws, even maybe a huge ensemble of universes too. For that reason, both the monotheistic religion and orthodox science fail to provide a complete account of physical existence. Now, when he wrote that article in the New York Times, he got all kinds of emails by atheists who are upset he said that because they can't possibly believe that science would start out on faith as well. That's just an impossibility, but it shows they don't really understand what he's talking about. And so I'm sure he had fun responding to those emails. But remember, if someone's asking you whether we actually believe that there is an efficient cause or a creator behind the universe, you can also talk about how science cannot explain the origin of the laws of nature, since the laws of nature, by definition, descriptions of the way nature, the cosmos works, and such laws cannot exist if there is no nature for them to describe. So at the beginning of the universe, when it began, I know there's different explanations about what the cause is, but the point is that science really started at the beginning of the universe because science needs the laws of nature to start even doing science. So I always ask people, where do the laws of nature come from? And could nature create itself? Obviously, it makes more sense to believe there's a cause outside nature that accounts for the laws of nature. So that's something to talk about when you're talking about a creator as well. And sometimes people debate whether science can really say anything about a creator, but the way science is defined now, the answer would probably be no, because look at the way this definition is given here. It says science is limited to explaining the natural world by means of natural processes. It cannot use supernatural causation in its explanations. Similarly, science is precluded from making statements about supernatural forces because these are outside its providence. Teaching about evolution, nature, and science. That's the title of that article, available at that website right there. So if science can only study the natural world, then it obviously cannot really speak to whether there is a creator. Now, that definition is being debated. Obviously, there's people within certain scientific fields that think the scientific field needs to be broadened out and needs to allow the possibility of looking for other kinds of causes other than naturalistic causation, but that's a debate that's been ongoing. But the point is that if people ask, whether you believe in a creator, and then they say, well, science has proven there's no creator, you can always ask them, what is the definition of science? Because apparently science can't allow God into the scientific realm to begin with. So that's part of the problem. And so we need to remember, as I just kind of said here, just kind of going over it again, science can only explain things, observations, events, and processes by relating them to the laws of nature. This is the meaning of scientific explanation. Explanations that do not appeal to laws of nature are not scientific, though they still may be true. This being the case, number two, science cannot explain the origin of the laws of nature, since any attempt to do so must by definition appeal to deeper laws of nature ad infinitum. Number three, since the laws of nature, again by definition, descriptions of the way nature and the cosmos work, such laws cannot exist if there is no nature for them to describe. Number four, they are therefore internal, never external to the cosmos and cannot create a cosmos or universe. And finally, the laws of nature could pre-exist creation in the mind of a non-material being who is external to any material cosmos. And remember, when we're talking about the Big Bang, as Hugh Ross says here in his book, The Creator and the Cosmos, the Big Bang is not a Big Bang as most lay people comprehend the term. This expression conjures up images of bomb blasts or exploding dynamite. Such a bang would yield disorder and destruction. In truth, this bang represents the immensely powerful yet carefully planned and controlled release of matter, energy, space, time, within the strict confines of carefully fine-tuned physical constants and laws that govern their behavior and interactions. And that's very important to understand because obviously there's been a lot of debate whether the standard traditional model, the cosmological evidence, supports the creation account in Genesis. Of course, that's debated. You can read about that in The Creator and the Cosmos by Hugh Ross. But most people think when they hear Big Bang, they think of the atheist view of it, but there is a different way of looking at it. So hopefully you can check that out. And remember that scientific explanations deal with impersonal objects and the laws of nature. They observe and measure how some events regularly follow. Whereas personal agent explanations is about investigating the mind or the agent behind the choice. And of course, we see agent explanations all around us. There's a motive, a will, an intention, and a means to carry out the purpose. So if you're going to ask whether there's a creator and then say science doesn't allow for a creator, you can also talk about there's different kinds of explanations to reality. Obviously, there are scientific explanations, but there are also personal and agent explanations. So these are just some of the things to talk about with people, get them to think a little further outside of the box and maybe get them to think about when they challenge you on whether you were a creationist or some, you can bring up some of these issues. So I hope these help you in your discussions. I know they've helped me a lot over the years, but obviously you can take this material and apply it if you want or try it out. Have a good day.